Hey guys, it's Fats here. It's a little bit late, so sorry if I seem a little bit tired, but I thought it would still be a good time to teach you guys a little bit about a sourdough starter. So really quickly, what a sourdough starter is a very controlled, I suppose, colony of microorganisms, and the way that we develop those microorganisms is by mixing flour and water and then leaving it to ferment almost. And what happens during that fermentation process is all the natural bacteria and all the microorganisms that live naturally on the flour, so on the actual wheat berry, they start to eat all the sugars in the flour itself. And during that feeding process, a byproduct of that is your carbon dioxide, so CO2 gas bubbles. So when you see your starter getting really active after a feeding, that's after a fresh feeding, that's all the microorganisms getting really, really busy and then eating all the sugars, and then essentially the byproduct of that is gas bubbles, and we use those gas bubbles in bread baking to make the bread rise. So to mix your sourdough starter, it's very, very simple. It's literally flour and water, and we leave that for a few days. So the process to get going takes a few days, but once we're there, you can train your starter into a very predictable rhythm that fits in with your bread baking schedule. Okay, so we're going to mix our sourdough starter. So what you need to make beforehand is a 50-50 blend of flour. So this is going to be essentially your food for your starter. What I mean by 50-50 blend is equal parts white baker's flour and whole wheat baker's flour. The reason we use whole wheat baker's flour is just there's a lot more natural sugars in the whole wheat baker's flour that allow a more vigorous starter. So what you want to do is get yourself your scales and weigh out 100 grams of 50-50 blend. Filtered water, you can just use water out of the tap, that's also fine, just at room temperature. And we're going to put 100 grams of water into the flour with your hands. And for some reason I like using my hands here, until there's no more lumps. Okay, so you can see now we've mixed the flour and water. It's only taken about a minute till there's no lumps. Grabbing a spatula, just scraping down the sides, and all we're going to do is get yourself a glass jar, and we're going to scrape all of that flour and water mixture into your glass jar. What I like to do then is cover it with a very loose fitting lid. In this case, what I've got is just a piece of baking paper that I've cut a little bit larger than the opening of the jar. Scrunched it up just so it's a little bit more malleable, and just covering it over like that. You still want the starter to breathe. You don't want the jar lid to be airtight at this point. You still want a little bit of airflow and circulation in there. What we're going to do with this is put it in not a cool, but just a sort of stable, temperature stable spot in the house we're going to say 2 days, but we'll check it after the first 24 hours. Right, so it's been 24 hours since we first mixed our sourdough starter yesterday. So let's take a look to see if there's any activity going on. Two key things that we're going to sort of look for. The first is any air bubbles and any sign of activity in sort of the rising and the falling of the starter. And the second thing is actually the smell. The smell's really important. with your starter, because what you're going to notice over the course of the time that you keep your starter is that it has a very varying degree of smells. So when you first feed it, it can be very sweet, what we call a young starter, to all the way to like a really sort of off-fruit, yeasty, beery, very strong kind of fermenting smell when we leave the starter a long time. So the first thing I'll do is take the lid off and check the smell. At the moment, it doesn't really smell anything more than like a pancake batter, which says to me that there's actually not a lot of activity going on yet, but that's fine. I wouldn't have expected anything to happen after 24 hours. And also, sorry, there's no real air bubbles in that. I don't notice any activity from a kind of yeasty activity perspective. So just grab a spatula and you can just mix it around in the jar there. And what this does is any spots of activity that could be starting to develop, it just mixes in any flour, gives them a little bit more food to start eating along the way. Yeast likes to be cozy and it likes to be warm. It's generally a lot more active when the ambient temperature is warmer. It'll probably take a few days, I'd say a good 2 or at least 3 days to kind of, for us to start seeing or smelling any signs of activity there. So get your little bit of parchment paper and we're going to pop the lid back on. And we'll stick that in the cupboard and we'll come back in another 24 hours and see what it's looking like. We've moved locations slightly. I can already see, just by looking on the outside, there's a heap of air bubbles and it looks like it's done a big rise. I can see there's markings up the side of the glass jar, so I can tell that it's really risen. There's still some leftover bubbles in there, so I know that we've got activity. Something's happening there. The yeast started to go a bit crazy. So take your lid off and yeah, starting to smell a little bit funky, a little bit fermented. So I'm not sure if you can see that there, but yes, lots of air bubbles in that starter. So we're definitely on the right track. So now I'm going to tell you guys how to do your first feeding. So essentially what we're going to do is give the starter some more food so it can continue to bubble and continue to be really active. And this is the process that you guys are going to get into pretty much every day, twice a day sometimes, depending on your baking, but just in terms of replenishing, giving it some new flour, giving it some new food so that it can keep being really active and get it into a bit of a predictable rhythm. What you want to do is discard about 80% of it. And a really good thing to do with that spent starter is stick it in the compost. So from our 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water that we started with, probably only need to keep about a tablespoon of starter. So to that starter, I'm going to reintroduce some flour. Hello. Reintroduce some flour. So I'm going to say approximately 100 grams of flour. At this stage, you don't, I know we started off with a very exacting measurement, but you really don't need to be too precise with your measurements at the moment. So we've got our 100 grams of flour added to that tablespoon of old starter and about 100 grams of water. And we're mixing that together, again, to form a slurry that's around the same consistency as we had when we first put the starter together. Essentially, this is giving those active yeasts and bacteria some new food to eat, which is really, really important. So I think I got that just about right there, that consistency. What we should see now is a much quicker... is a much quicker rate of activity. So in the next sort of few hours, we should start seeing that starting to rise and starting to bubble. So I'll check back tomorrow in 24 hours time, and we'll see what the starter's looking like in 24 hours.
No.
See you then. Can you say bye-bye? Say bye. Bye. Okay, so we were about 4 or 5 days after we first mixed our sourdough starter, and over every day it's been progressively getting more active and more bubbly, and all the yeasts are really starting to go a little bit crazy. So what I've been doing once every evening is doing the feeding again. So that was discarding about 80% of it, keeping about 15 to 20% of the starter, and then mixing in fresh flour and fresh water. So I'll just show you guys what it looks like now. So this is at a really active stage. You can see all the bubbles in there, and look to the side there if you can see all those air bubbles in the side. So that's the sign that we're getting a really good lot of yeast activity. And if I just show you in the top there, when I move it, you can see all those beautiful pockets of air, and it's getting really sticky and slimy and goopy. So that's exactly what we're after. It's starting to smell mildly acidic, which is a sign that, you know, in a few days we're going to be ready to bake. If you miss a feeding, that's absolutely fine. If you miss a day, don't worry about it, don't sweat, you won't kill it. You'll probably only kill it if you leave it for like a week or something like that. So if you miss a feeding, don't worry about it. Just start over your regular feeding cycle again, and that'll be that'll kind of get it back into its natural rhythm. If you want to stop your starter from going so quickly, so if you don't want to have to feed it every day, you can put it in the fridge. So what I would suggest you do is give it a feeding, wait about an hour, and then after that hour put it straight in the fridge. So what it will do, it won't completely stop the yeast activity, but it will slow it down to a crawl. And then a couple of days before you want to bake, take it out of the fridge, let that bubbling start going again, and then start your feeding cycle as normal. So look, I hope this has been informative, and I hope that you guys are going to start putting together your sourdough starters, and then hopefully make some bread. If you've got any questions, please just hit me up on Instagram or YouTube. Happy to answer any bread baking questions or any food related questions as we go. So yeah, I'll see you hopefully for the next video, which will be starting to bake your first loaf of bread with the starter. See you then. This is Food with Fats.